Dr. Elena Rodriguez was stirring her morning coffee when the ground beneath her feet trembled. The 42-year-old seismologist paused, her trained instincts immediately recognizing something was wrong. This wasn't the gentle rumble of a passing truck or the vibration from nearby construction. This was different. Dangerous. She set down her mug and grabbed the seismic monitoring app on her phone. The readings made her stomach drop. A 6.8 magnitude earthquake had struck just 12 miles away, centered directly under the downtown business district. Elena knew what that meant. In a city that hadn't updated its building codes in decades, where many structures were built in the 1960s with substandard materials, this was going to be catastrophic. Elena had spent the last 15 years studying earthquake damage patterns. She had crawled through collapsed buildings in Haiti, searched for survivors in the rubble of Nepal, and led rescue operations in Turkey. She understood better than almost anyone else how buildings fail during seismic events, where people were most likely to survive, and how to find them before it was too late. But, right now, none of that mattered. She was just Elena Rodriguez, a woman in jeans and a sweater, standing in her kitchen 30 miles from downtown. Her phone buzzed with emergency alerts. Reports were already coming in of a major building collapse. The Meridian office complex, a 12-story building that housed over 300 employees, had pancaked during the quake. Elena knew the building. She had actually written a report 3 years ago warning that it was vulnerable to seismic activity. The city had filed her recommendations away and done nothing. Now people were trapped inside. Elena grabbed her emergency kit from the hall closet. Years of disaster response had taught her to always be prepared. The kit contained specialized equipment that most people had never seen: acoustic listening devices for detecting survivors, fiber optic cameras for searching through small spaces, structural assessment tools, and medical supplies designed for confined space rescues. She threw the kit in her car and started driving toward downtown. Traffic was already backing up as people tried to flee the area, but Elena knew shortcuts from her years working with the city planning department. She took surface streets, back alleys, and maintenance roads, making her way closer to the disaster zone. As she drove, Elena tried calling the city emergency management office. She had worked with them before on earthquake preparedness planning. They knew her credentials, knew her experience. But the phones were busy, overwhelmed with incoming calls. She tried the fire department dispatcher. Same thing. Everyone was in crisis mode, and nobody had time to take a call from a civilian offering help. Elena arrived at the scene 45 minutes after the earthquake. The sight that greeted her was worse than she had feared. The Meridian office complex had indeed collapsed, but not in the way she would have predicted. Instead of a clean pancake collapse, the building had twisted as it fell, creating a chaotic jumble of concrete, steel, and glass. This type of collapse was actually more dangerous for rescue operations, but it also created more potential survival spaces. She parked 3 blocks away and walked toward the disaster zone, carrying her emergency kit. The area was already swarming with first responders. Fire trucks lined the streets, their red lights painting the dusty air. Ambulances waited with their back doors open, ready to receive survivors. Police officers were setting up barricades to keep civilians away from the dangerous debris field. Elena approached the command post, a cluster of emergency vehicles where the incident commanders were coordinating the response. She could see Fire Chief Tom Morrison, a man she had worked with on several emergency planning exercises. He would remember her, would know that she wasn't just another bystander wanting to help. "Chief Morrison," Elena called out as she approached. "It's Elena Rodriguez from the Seismic Safety Division. I need to brief you on the structural characteristics of this building." The fire chief looked up from the papers he was reviewing, his face streaked with sweat and dust. For a moment, Elena thought she saw recognition in his eyes. But then, his expression hardened. "Ma'am, I need you to get back behind the safety perimeter," he said, not really looking at her. "We have this under control." Elena blinked in surprise. "Chief, I think you misunderstand. I'm Dr. Rodriguez. I wrote the seismic assessment report on this building. I know where the strongest survival spaces are likely to be located." But Chief Morrison was already turning away, focused on a conversation with one of his lieutenants. Elena stood there for a moment, unsure what had just happened. She tried again. "Chief Morrison, I have specialized equipment for urban search and rescue. I've done this before. In Haiti, Nepal, Turkey. I can help locate survivors. This time, the fire chief did look at her, and his expression was annoyed. Ma'am, I told you to get back. We have trained professionals handling this. We don't need civilians getting in the way. Elena felt a surge of frustration. She wasn't a civilian. She was probably the most qualified person at this entire scene when it came to understanding how this specific building had failed and where survivors might be found. But, before she could explain further, a police officer appeared at her elbow. Come on, lady, the officer said, taking hold of her arm. You need to move back to the safe zone. Elena allowed herself to be led away, her mind racing. She understood that disaster scenes were chaotic, that everyone was under tremendous stress. But, she also knew that time was critical. Every minute that passed reduced the chances of finding survivors. And, she was watching precious time tick away while the people who could actually locate trapped victims were being treated like obstacles. Behind the police barrier, Elena found herself grouped with other civilians who had been pushed back from the scene. There were family members of people who worked in the building, local residents who had come out to see what was happening, and reporters trying to get interviews. Elena pulled out her phone and tried calling the emergency management office again. This time, she got through to a dispatcher. This is Dr. Elena Rodriguez, she said. I need to speak with Director Martinez immediately. I'm at the Meridian building collapse, and I have critical information about survivor location protocols. The dispatcher put her on hold. Elena watched as firefighters began setting up heavy equipment near the debris pile. They were preparing to start moving large chunks of concrete, which was exactly the wrong approach for this type of collapse. Elena knew that the twisted structure meant there were likely void spaces where people could survive, but those spaces would be destroyed if they started removing debris from the wrong places. After 5 minutes on hold, the dispatcher came back on the line. Dr. Rodriguez, Director Martinez is in an emergency meeting. He'll have to call you back. Elena hung up, frustrated. She looked around at the rescue operation taking shape before her. Fire crews were discussing how to bring in heavy cranes to lift the larger pieces of debris. Paramedics were setting up a treatment area for survivors. Search and rescue teams were suiting up in their protective gear. But nobody was actually searching for survivors yet. They were still in the planning phase, still figuring out logistics and safety protocols. Elena knew that in a building collapse like this, the first 6 hours were critical. After that, the chances of finding people alive dropped dramatically. She tried a different approach. Elena walked over to one of the search and rescue teams that was preparing their equipment. These were professionals who specialized in urban disaster response. They would understand the value of her expertise. Excuse me, Elena said to the team leader, a man in his 30s wearing a helmet with USAR marked on the side. I'm Dr. Elena Rodriguez. I'm a seismologist specializing in building collapse patterns. I have information about this specific structure that could help your search efforts. The team leader looked up from the rope rigging he was checking. That's great, ma'am, but we need to stick to our protocols. The incident commander will brief us on any structural information we need. Elena persisted. But I don't think the incident commander has the detailed information about this building's construction. I know where the reinforced spaces are, where people would most likely survive. I can save you hours of searching in the wrong places. The team leader's expression became impatient. Look, I appreciate your concern, but we're trained professionals. We know how to do our jobs. The best thing you can do is stay out of the way and let us work. Elena stepped back, feeling increasingly desperate. She could see that the rescue teams were good at what they did, but they were approaching this collapse as a generic building failure. They didn't understand the specific vulnerabilities of this structure, the way it had been built, the modifications that had been made over the years. She tried approaching several other rescue workers, but each interaction followed the same pattern. They saw her civilian clothes, heard her trying to offer advice, and immediately categorized her as another well-meaning bystander who didn't understand how emergency operations worked. Elena retreated to the edge of the safety perimeter, feeling helpless. She pulled out a notebook and started sketching the building collapse pattern, trying to analyze the debris distribution from what she could see. Based on the twist pattern and the way the floors had buckled, she could identify at least 3 areas where survival spaces were likely to exist. One area in particular caught her attention. Near the northeast corner of the building, she could see a section where a concrete support beam had fallen at an angle, creating a triangular void space. The way the debris had settled suggested there might be a significant cavity underneath, possibly large enough for several people to survive in. Elena studied the debris pattern more carefully. The firefighters were planning to start their search from the south side of the building, which made sense from a safety perspective but was unlikely to reach any survivors quickly. Meanwhile, the northeast corner where Elena had identified the potential survival space was being ignored because it looked more dangerous to access. She watched in growing frustration as the rescue teams continued their preparations. They were being methodical and careful, which was normally a good thing. But Elena knew that methodical and careful might not be fast enough for anyone trapped in the building. A news crew had arrived and was setting up cameras near the police barriers. Elena watched as a reporter interviewed Chief Morrison about the rescue efforts. The chief spoke confidently about their protocols and procedures, assuring viewers that they were doing everything possible to locate survivors. Elena knew they were doing their best. But their best wasn't going to be enough, because they were missing critical information that could save lives. And nobody was willing to listen to the person who had that information. As the afternoon wore on, Elena remained at the scene, hoping for another opportunity to share what she knew. She watched heavy equipment arrive and begin the slow process of debris removal. She watched search teams carefully probe sections of the rubble pile. She watched family members wait anxiously behind the barriers for news of their loved ones. But she didn't watch anyone find survivors. By evening, the rescue operation had been going for 8 hours, and no survivors had been located. Elena knew that didn't mean there weren't any people still alive in the building, but it did mean that time was running out. The longer it took to find survivors, the less likely they were to survive their injuries, dehydration, or breathing problems from dust and debris. Elena had filled 3 pages of her notebook with structural analysis and survivor probability maps. She had identified 7 specific locations where people were most likely to be found alive. But that information remained locked in her notebook, ignored by the very people who needed it most. As the sun began to set over the disaster scene, Elena realized that she was going to have to find another way to help. The official rescue operation wasn't interested in her expertise, but that didn't mean her expertise was worthless. It just meant she would have to find a different way to use it. Elena looked once more at the debris pile, at the scattered remains of a building where hundreds of people had been working just that morning. Somewhere in that tangle of concrete and steel, people were waiting for rescue. People who might not survive another night if they weren't found soon. She closed her notebook and walked back to her car, her mind already working on a new plan. If the rescue operation wouldn't accept her help through official channels, she would have to find unofficial ones. Because giving up wasn't an option when lives were at stake. Elena sat in her car for several minutes, thinking through her options. The official rescue operation had made it clear they didn't want her involvement, but she couldn't simply walk away knowing that her expertise could save lives. She had to find another approach. Her first idea was to go around the local incident commanders and contact state or federal emergency management. Elena had worked with FEMA on several previous disasters, and she had contacts in the State Emergency Response Division. Perhaps they could authorize her participation in the rescue effort. Elena drove to a quiet parking lot a few blocks away and started making phone calls. Her first call was to David Shen, a FEMA coordinator she had worked with during the Nepal earthquake response. David knew her credentials and had seen her work firsthand. "Elena, thank God you called," David said when he answered. "I just heard about the collapse in your city. Are you on scene?" Elena explained the situation, describing both the building collapse and her frustrating attempts to offer assistance to the local rescue teams. David listened carefully, asking detailed questions about the structure and the response so far. "This is ridiculous," David said when Elena finished. "You're exactly the kind of specialist they need for this type of collapse. Let me make some calls. I should be able to get you officially attached to the operation through federal channels." Elena felt a surge of hope. "How long do you think that will take?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Well, I'll need to contact the regional emergency coordinator, who will need to communicate with the local incident command. Probably a few hours to get the paperwork sorted out." Elena's heart sank. A few hours might be too long. People trapped in building collapses faced a rapidly declining survival rate. Brain injuries from falling debris, internal bleeding, dehydration, hypothermia, and respiratory problems from dust inhalation all became increasingly deadly as time passed. David, can you expedite that process somehow? Every hour we delay reduces the chances of finding survivors. David promised to do his best, but Elena could hear in his voice that bureaucratic processes had their own timeline, regardless of the urgency of the situation. After hanging up, Elena tried calling her former supervisor at the city planning department. Dr. Sarah Kim had left the city government 2 years ago to work for a private consulting firm, but she still had contacts throughout the emergency management system. Elena, I saw the news coverage, Sarah said. This is exactly the kind of disaster you warned them about. I still have your seismic safety report on that building. Elena explained her situation, and Sarah was immediately outraged. They're not letting you participate in the rescue? That's insane. You know more about urban collapse patterns than anyone else in the region. Sarah promised to reach out to her contacts in the mayor's office and the emergency management department. But she also warned Elena that it might take time to cut through the jurisdictional politics and bureaucratic protocols that govern disaster response. Elena made 3 more calls to various officials and emergency management contacts. Each conversation followed a similar pattern: initial shock that her expertise was being ignored, promises to make calls and pull strings, and warnings that the official process might take several hours to resolve. By the time Elena finished her phone calls, it was already getting dark. She had been away from the disaster scene for over 2 hours, and she knew that every minute counted. Even if her contacts were successful in getting her officially attached to the rescue operation, it might be too late to make a difference. Elena drove back to the disaster scene, hoping to find that the rescue teams had made progress in her absence. What she found instead was a scene of organized frustration. The rescue operation had expanded significantly, with additional crews arriving from neighboring jurisdictions. Floodlights had been set up to illuminate the debris pile, and the area buzzed with activity. But still no survivors had been found. Elena parked and walked back to the police perimeter, where she could observe the rescue efforts. She could see that the teams had been working systematically, carefully removing debris from several sections of the collapsed building. Their approach was methodical and safe, but Elena could tell they were searching in areas that were unlikely to contain survivors. Meanwhile, the northeast corner area that Elena had identified as a high-probability survivor location remained untouched. The rescue team seemed to be avoiding it because the debris pile in that area looked unstable and dangerous to approach. Elena pulled out her binoculars and studied the area more carefully. What she saw made her pulse quicken. There was definitely a void space under the angled concrete beam she had noticed earlier. And, more importantly, she thought she could see something that might be fabric or clothing visible in the shadows of the debris. Elena tried to get the attention of the nearest rescue worker, a woman in an orange safety vest who was coordinating equipment near the perimeter. "Excuse me," Elena called out. "I think I can see something in the northeast section of the debris. There might be a person visible in the void space under that concrete beam." The rescue worker looked where Elena was pointing, squinting in the dim light. "I don't see anything," she said. "And that area is too unstable for us to access right now. We're focusing on the sections where we can safely operate." Elena tried to explain what she was seeing, but the rescue worker was already moving on to other tasks. Elena realized that without binoculars and without her trained eye for reading collapse patterns, the rescue workers simply couldn't see what Elena was seeing. Elena walked along the perimeter, trying to find a better viewing angle. From a different position, she could see even more clearly into the void space. There was definitely something there, something that didn't belong in a pile of construction debris. Elena approached another rescue worker, a paramedic who was organizing medical supplies near one of the ambulances. "There's someone in the northeast section," Elena said urgently. "I can see them from here. They need immediate attention." The paramedic looked skeptical. "Ma'am, I know you want to help, but we have trained spotters watching for any signs of survivors. If there was someone visible, they would have seen them." Elena tried to hand the paramedic her binoculars. "Please, just look for yourself. There's a void space under the large concrete beam. I can see fabric that looks like clothing." But the paramedic waved away the binoculars. "Our teams know what they're doing. If there were survivors in that area, they would have detected them with their equipment." Elena felt a familiar surge of frustration. The rescue teams had sophisticated listening devices and cameras for searching through debris, but they were only using that equipment in areas they had already identified for search. They weren't investigating the area where Elena could actually see evidence of a survivor. Elena walked to several other positions around the perimeter, confirming what she was seeing. From multiple angles, she could detect what appeared to be a person trapped in the void space. But every rescue worker she approached dismissed her observations. After 2 hours of trying to get someone to investigate the area she had identified, Elena realized she was facing a fundamental problem. The rescue operation was organized around official protocols and chains of command. Individual observations from civilians, no matter how expert, couldn't be easily incorporated into their systematic approach. Elena called David Chen again to check on the status of her federal authorization. "I'm still working on it," David said. "The regional coordinator is trying to reach the local incident commander, but there's some kind of jurisdictional issue. The local authorities are insisting that they have sufficient expertise and don't need additional specialists." Elena explained what she was seeing in the debris pile, the potential survivor that no one was investigating. "Elena, you need to find a way to get their attention," David said. "If you're right about this, someone is going to die while we're arguing about paperwork." Elena hung up and stared at the disaster scene, thinking hard about her options. The official channels were failing, and time was running out. She needed to find a way to get the rescue teams to investigate the northeast area, even if it meant going outside normal procedures. Elena's first unofficial attempt was to approach some of the family members waiting behind the barriers. If relatives of the trapped workers started demanding that the rescue teams investigate a specific area, that might carry more weight than observations from a random civilian. Elena found a group of family members who were anxiously watching the rescue efforts. She approached a middle-aged woman who appeared to be coordinating communication among the families. "Excuse me," Elena said. "I'm Dr. Elena Rodriguez. I specialize in building collapse analysis. I think I've spotted someone in the debris who needs immediate rescue." The woman looked up hopefully. "Where? Have you told the rescue teams?" Elena explained the situation, pointing out the northeast area and describing what she had observed. The woman, who introduced herself as Maria Santos, listened carefully. "My husband Carlos works on the 8th floor," Maria said. "That area you're pointing to, that might be where his office was located." Maria called over several other family members, and Elena repeated her observations. Soon, a small group of relatives was demanding that the rescue teams investigate the northeast section. But, when Maria approached the incident command post with her group, they received the same response that Elena had gotten earlier. The rescue coordinator explained that they were working systematically through the building and would reach that area when it was safe to do so. "But, this woman says she can see someone right now," Maria insisted. "My husband might be dying while you're waiting to get to that section." The rescue coordinator was sympathetic but firm. "Ma'am, I understand your concern. But we have to follow safety protocols. We can't risk additional lives by rushing into unstable areas." Elena watched the interaction from a distance, feeling increasingly desperate. The rescue coordinator wasn't wrong about the safety concerns. The northeast section did look dangerous to access. But Elena knew that the apparent instability was actually deceptive. The angled concrete beam that looked precarious was actually well supported by the debris underneath it. And there was a safe approach route that would allow rescuers to reach the void space without destabilizing the surrounding structure. But she couldn't communicate that knowledge to people who had already decided she wasn't qualified to have an opinion. Elena tried one more approach through unofficial channels. She had noticed several news crews covering the disaster, and she knew that media attention sometimes motivated emergency officials to take action they might otherwise delay. Elena approached a news reporter who was preparing for a live broadcast near the police perimeter. "Excuse me," Elena said. "I'm Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a seismologist who specializes in earthquake damage. I have important information about this rescue operation that your viewers should hear." The reporter, a young woman with perfectly styled hair despite the dusty conditions, looked interested. "Are you with the rescue teams?" Elena explained her credentials and her unsuccessful attempts to share crucial information with the rescue operation. She described the potential survivor she had spotted and the rescue team's refusal to investigate the area. The reporter's eyes lit up. This was exactly the kind of human interest story that made for compelling television, an expert being ignored while lives hung in the balance. "Would you be willing to do an on-camera interview about this?" the reporter asked. Elena hesitated. She didn't want to create problems for the rescue teams, who were genuinely trying their best under difficult circumstances. But, if a news story was what it took to get someone to investigate the area where she had spotted a potential survivor, it might be worth the controversy. "I'll do the interview if it helps get attention for that trapped person," Elena said. The reporter quickly set up for a live shot, positioning Elena so that the disaster scene was visible in the background. As the camera rolled, Elena explained her qualifications, described what she was seeing in the debris, and expressed her frustration with the rescue operation's response to her observations. The interview was broadcast live on the local evening news, and Elena hoped it would generate enough attention to force the rescue teams to investigate the northeast area. But, as the hours passed, nothing changed. The rescue operation continued its methodical approach, and the area where Elena had spotted the potential survivor remained unexamined. By midnight, Elena was exhausted and deeply frustrated. She had tried every official and unofficial channel she could think of, and none of them had been successful. Meanwhile, if there really was a person trapped in that void space, their chances of survival were diminishing with each passing hour. Elena sat in her car in the parking lot, staring at the floodlit disaster scene. She had spent over 12 hours trying to work within the system, trying to get her expertise acknowledged and her observations investigated. But the system wasn't designed to handle input from outside its established structure, even when that input came from someone uniquely qualified to provide it. Elena realized she was facing a choice. She could give up and go home, accepting that she had done everything she could through proper channels. Or she could find a way to investigate the potential survivor herself, even if it meant operating outside the official rescue effort. The thought of acting independently was frightening. Elena was a scientist, not a rescue worker. She understood building collapses in theory, but she had never personally extracted someone from dangerous debris. If she was wrong about the structural stability of the northeast area, she could make things worse instead of better. But, as Elena sat there in the darkness, she kept thinking about the fabric she had seen in the void space. Someone was trapped in that debris pile, waiting for rescue that might never come through official channels. Elena had the knowledge to reach that person safely, and she had the equipment in her emergency kit to provide assistance. Elena looked at her watch. It was 12:30 a.m., exactly 16 hours since the earthquake had struck. The rescue operation was continuing around the clock, but the teams on duty were focused on the south side of the building, far from the area where Elena had spotted the potential survivor. Elena made her decision. If the system wouldn't allow her to help through official channels, she would find a way to help on her own. Because sometimes doing the right thing meant operating outside the system, especially when the system was failing to serve its intended purpose. Elena checked her emergency kit one more time, making sure she had everything she might need for an unauthorized rescue attempt. Then, she started planning her approach to the northeast section of the debris pile, determined to reach the person she believed was trapped there, regardless of the official rescue operations policies. Elena spent the next hour studying the layout of the disaster scene and planning her approach. The rescue operation was running 24 hours a day, but the overnight crews were smaller than the daytime teams. More importantly, their focus was entirely on the south side of the building, where they had established safe access routes and were methodically working through the debris. The northeast section where Elena had spotted the potential survivor was in a darker area, away from the main floodlights. This would provide some cover for Elena's unauthorized rescue attempt, but it would also make the work more dangerous. Elena examined the security perimeter carefully. The police barriers were designed to keep casual onlookers away, but they weren't meant to stop someone who was determined to get through. There were gaps between the barriers, and several areas where the lighting was dim enough to provide concealment. At 2 a.m., Elena made her move. She parked her car several blocks away and approached the disaster site on foot, carrying her emergency kit in a backpack. She had changed into dark clothing and work boots, trying to look like she belonged at a construction site. Elena waited until the patrol officers were focused on other areas, then slipped through a gap between two police barriers. She moved carefully through the shadows, using her knowledge of the building's original layout to navigate around the most dangerous areas of debris. The northeast section looked even more treacherous up close. The angled concrete beam that Elena had identified from a distance was actually a massive structural support that had fallen across several smaller pieces of debris.
The void space underneath was larger than Elena had realized, easily big enough for multiple people to survive in.
Elena pulled out her flashlight and carefully examined the area. She could see that her initial assessment had been correct. The angled beam was actually stable, supported by the debris pile in a way that created a natural shelter. But reaching the void space would require crawling under the beam, through a narrow opening that was partially blocked by twisted metal and broken concrete. Elena set up her acoustic listening device, a sensitive microphone designed to detect sounds through debris. She positioned it near the opening to the void space and put on headphones to listen for any signs of life. At first, she heard only the ambient noise of the rescue operation, diesel engines, radio chatter, and the grinding sound of heavy equipment. But, as Elena fine-tuned the device and filtered out the background noise, she detected something else. There was a rhythmic sound coming from inside the void space, too regular to be caused by settling debris or wind. It sounded like someone tapping on metal, the kind of sound a trapped person might make to signal for help. Elena's heart raced. She was right. There was someone alive in the void space, and they were trying to communicate. Elena tapped back on the concrete beam, using the universal rescue signal: 3 quick taps, pause, 3 quick taps, pause, 3 quick taps. The response was immediate. The tapping from inside the void space changed to match Elena's pattern, confirming that there was indeed a conscious person trapped under the debris. Elena quickly set up her fiber optic camera, feeding the thin cable through the narrow opening into the void space. The camera provided a fisheye view of the interior, and what Elena saw made her gasp. There were 3 people trapped in the space. 2 men and a woman, all of whom appeared to be office workers based on their clothing. One of the men was lying motionless, possibly unconscious or worse. The woman was sitting against a piece of debris, and she was the one who had been tapping. The third person, a younger man, appeared to be injured but alert. Elena spoke into the microphone attached to her fiber optic system.
"Can you hear me? My name is Elena. I'm here to help you."
The woman's face appeared in front of the camera, her expression a mixture of hope and exhaustion. "Thank God," she said, her voice barely above a whisper.
"We've been trapped here for almost 18 hours.
Michael is hurt badly, and Robert hasn't moved for several hours." Elena's mind raced through the logistics of what would be required to extract 3 people from this space. It wasn't a job for one person, especially someone without specialized rescue training. But Elena also knew that if she left to get help through official channels, it would take hours to convince anyone to authorize a rescue attempt in this area.
"What are your names?" Elena asked, trying to keep the conversation going while she figured out her next steps.
"I'm Jennifer Walsh," the woman replied. "The injured man is Michael Chen, and the unconscious one is Robert Martinez.
We all work for the accounting firm on the 8th floor." Elena remembered Maria Santos, the woman at the police barriers whose husband Carlos worked on the 8th floor. These might be Carlos's co-workers, and Carlos himself might be trapped somewhere else in the building.
"Jennifer, I need to assess your injuries before we can plan a rescue," Elena said.
"Can you tell me how badly Michael is hurt?" Jennifer moved the camera so Elena could see Michael.
The young man was conscious but clearly in pain. His left arm was bent at an unnatural angle, and there was dried blood on his forehead. "I think his arm is broken," Jennifer said. "And he might have a concussion. He was confused for several hours after the collapse, but he's been more alert lately."
Elena could see that Michael's injuries, while serious, weren't immediately life-threatening. But Robert was a different story. The unconscious man hadn't moved during the entire conversation, and Elena couldn't tell if he was breathing. "Jennifer, can you check Robert's pulse?" Elena asked.
Jennifer moved over to Robert and placed her hand on his neck. After a moment, she nodded. "He has a pulse, but it's very weak. And his breathing is really shallow."
Elena knew that Robert needed immediate medical attention, the kind that could only be provided by paramedics with proper equipment.
But getting paramedics to this location would require convincing the rescue teams to change their priorities and allocate resources to an area they had deemed too dangerous to access.
Elena made a decision.
She would try one more time to get official help, but this time she had evidence that couldn't be ignored: live video and audio contact with trapped survivors.
"Jennifer, I need to go get help," Elena said.
"But I'll be back as quickly as possible. In the meantime, try to keep Robert warm and monitor his breathing." If it gets worse, tap on the metal beam in the pattern I showed you earlier. Elena carefully packed up her equipment and made her way back through the debris field toward the official rescue operation. This time, she didn't try to approach the incident commanders diplomatically. Instead, she went straight to the nearest rescue team and demanded their attention. "I have live contact with 3 survivors," Elena announced, approaching a group of rescue workers who were taking a break near one of the fire trucks.
"I have video and audio proof. They need immediate medical attention." The rescue workers looked at Elena skeptically.
She was obviously a civilian, and her clothes were now dirty from crawling through the debris. She looked like any other unauthorized person who had somehow gotten past the security perimeter. "Ma'am, you need to get back behind the barriers," one of the rescue workers said. "You could get hurt wandering around in the debris field." Elena pulled out her fiber optic camera and played back the video she had recorded in the void space. "Look at this. 3 people trapped in the northeast section. One of them is unconscious and needs immediate medical attention." The rescue workers gathered around Elena's small video screen, watching the footage of Jennifer, Michael, and Robert. Elena could see their expressions change as they realized what they were looking at. "This is real," one of them asked. "You actually talked to these people?" Elena played the audio recording of her conversation with Jennifer. The rescue workers listened intently, and Elena could see that they were finally taking her seriously. "We need to get this to the incident commander immediately," the team leader said. "If there are confirmed survivors in that area, everything changes." Elena followed the rescue team to the command post, where they interrupted a briefing to share her video and audio evidence. Chief Morrison, who had dismissed Elena earlier that day, stared at the footage with a mixture of amazement and concern. "Where exactly is this location?" the chief asked Elena. Elena spread out a diagram of the building and pointed to the northeast section. "It's under this fallen support beam. The access is difficult, but the structure is actually stable. I can show your teams how to reach them safely." Chief Morrison studied the diagram, then looked at Elena more carefully. "You're the woman from earlier today. The one who said she was a seismologist." "Dr. Elena Rodriguez," Elena said. "I've been trying to tell you about this location for almost 20 hours. There was an awkward silence as Chief Morrison realized the implications of what Elena was saying. If he had listened to her earlier, these 3 people could have been rescued many hours ago. "Dr. Rodriguez," the chief said carefully, "we're going to need your expertise to plan this rescue. Can you brief our teams on the safest approach to that location?" Elena felt a mixture of relief and frustration. Finally, her knowledge was being taken seriously. But it had taken finding survivors on her own to get anyone to listen to her. Elena spent the next 30 minutes briefing the rescue teams on the structural characteristics of the northeast section, the safest routes of approach, and the equipment that would be needed to extract 3 people from the confined space. As the rescue teams prepared their equipment, Elena's phone rang. It was David Chen, calling with an update on her federal authorization. "Elena, I finally got through the red tape," David said. "You're officially attached to the rescue operation as a federal structural specialist. Sorry it took so long." Elena looked at the rescue teams that were now scrambling to reach the survivors she had found. "Thanks, David, but I think the official authorization might be a little late." While the rescue teams organized their approach to the northeast section, Elena returned to the police barriers to update the family members on what she had found. Maria Santos was still there, having maintained a vigil throughout the night. "I found 3 people," Elena told Maria. "Jennifer Walsh, Michael Chen, and Robert Martinez. Do you know if your husband worked with any of them?" Maria's face lit up with hope. "Michael Chen, yes. He and Carlos are friends. They work in the same department. If you found Michael, Carlos might be nearby." Elena felt a pang of guilt. She had only searched one small area of the collapsed building, and there were probably other survivors scattered throughout the debris. Her success in finding 3 people also highlighted how many others might still be waiting for rescue in locations that hadn't been investigated. Elena watched as the professional rescue teams approached the void space she had found hours earlier. They moved carefully and methodically, using proper safety equipment and procedures that Elena hadn't had access to during her unauthorized rescue attempt. But Elena could also see that her initial assessment had been correct. The rescue teams were able to reach the void space safely, confirming that the area she had identified was structurally sound despite its dangerous appearance. The first person extracted was Jennifer Walsh, who emerged from the debris conscious but exhausted. She was immediately surrounded by paramedics and loaded into an ambulance. Next came Michael Chen, who required more careful handling because of his broken arm and possible concussion. The rescue teams had to immobilize him before moving him through the narrow access route.
Robert Martinez was the most challenging extraction.
The unconscious man had to be carefully maneuvered onto a backboard and passed through the confined space piece by piece. It took over an hour to get him safely out of the void space and into the hands of the medical team. As Elena watched the 3 survivors being loaded into ambulances, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that the people had been found and rescued. Pride that her expertise had ultimately made a difference. But also frustration at how difficult it had been to get anyone to listen to her knowledge, and concern about how many other survivors might still be waiting in areas that hadn't been properly investigated. Elena realized that her role in this disaster was far from over. The rescue of Jennifer, Michael, and Robert had proven that her structural analysis could save lives. But it had also revealed significant problems with how emergency operations incorporated specialized expertise from outside their established chains of command. As dawn broke over the disaster scene, Elena knew that the lessons learned from this night would have implications far beyond this single rescue operation.
The success of the Northeast Section rescue transformed Elena's role at the disaster scene overnight.
Word spread quickly through the rescue teams that the civilian woman they had been dismissing for 20 hours was actually a highly qualified specialist who had located 3 survivors that their systematic search had missed. By 6 a.m., Elena found herself officially integrated into the incident command structure. Chief Morrison, who had been so dismissive the previous day, personally apologized and asked Elena to conduct a complete structural analysis of the remaining debris field.
"Dr. Rodriguez, I owe you an apology," the fire chief said as they stood near the command post.
"Your expertise could have saved us hours of searching in the wrong places.
I should have listened to you from the beginning."
Elena appreciated the apology, but she was more focused on the task ahead.
"Chief, we need to completely reassess our search priorities.
The systematic grid approach you've been using works for some types of collapses, but this building failed in a complex pattern that creates isolated survival spaces." Elena spread out her structural analysis notes on a table at the command post. Her sketches and calculations from the previous day, combined with what she had learned from the successful rescue, painted a very different picture of where survivors were likely to be found. "Based on the twist pattern of the collapse, I can identify 6 high-probability survival areas," Elena explained to the assembled rescue team leaders. 3 of them haven't been searched at all, and 2 others were only briefly investigated. Captain Lisa Rodriguez from the Urban Search and Rescue Team studied Elena's analysis.
"You're saying we've been searching in the areas least likely to contain survivors?" Elena nodded.
"Your safety-first approach makes complete sense from a risk management perspective. But it led you to focus on the areas where the debris was most stable and easy to access. Unfortunately, those are also the areas where the collapse was most complete, making survival less likely."
Elena pointed to specific sections of her diagram.
"The areas that look most dangerous are actually where the collapse created void spaces. The falling debris formed natural shelters, but accessing them requires navigating through what appears to be unstable wreckage."
The rescue team leaders exchanged glances.
Everything Elena was saying contradicted their standard operating procedures, which emphasized working from the safest areas outward. "Dr. Rodriguez," Captain Rodriguez said, "what you're proposing would expose our teams to significant additional risk."
"How can we justify that?"
Elena understood their concern, but she also knew that the current approach was failing to find survivors who were still alive.
"Captain, I'm not suggesting that you ignore safety protocols.
I'm saying that we can access these high-probability areas safely if we understand the structural mechanics of how this specific building collapsed." Elena spent the next hour walking the rescue team leaders through the debris field, showing them how to read the collapse patterns and identify load-bearing elements that would support their weight. She demonstrated how the apparently unstable piles of debris were actually held in place by underlying structural elements.
"This pile of concrete blocks looks precarious," Elena explained, pointing to one area.
"But if you approach it from this angle, you can see that it's actually supported by this steel beam, which is anchored into the foundation.
You can safely access the void space underneath without disturbing the pile."
The rescue teams were impressed by Elena's ability to analyze the structural situation, but they remained cautious about implementing her recommendations. Their training emphasized methodical, low-risk approaches that prioritized rescuer safety above speed of operations. Elena realized she was asking them to fundamentally change their approach in the middle of an ongoing operation, which was a difficult request even when supported by expert analysis. The breakthrough came when Elena's structural analysis led to the discovery of a second group of survivors. Elena had identified the northwest corner of the building as another high-probability survival area. Like the northeast section, it appeared dangerous because of hanging debris and unstable-looking piles of concrete. But Elena's analysis showed that the underlying structure was actually solid. Elena accompanied Captain Rodriguez's team to the northwest area, serving as a structural advisor as they planned their approach. Using Elena's analysis, the team was able to identify a safe route to what appeared to be a void space under a fallen floor slab. The acoustic listening devices immediately detected signs of life. Multiple voices could be heard calling for help from beneath the debris. Elena's fiber optic camera revealed 4 people trapped in a space that had been formed when a section of the 9th floor collapsed at an angle, creating a triangular shelter. This time, the rescue proceeded smoothly. With Elena advising on structural stability, the rescue teams were able to safely access the void space and extract all 4 survivors. None of them had life-threatening injuries, though they were dehydrated and exhausted after almost 24 hours in the debris. The success of the Northwest rescue convinced the incident command team that Elena's approach was not only scientifically sound but also operationally effective. Chief Morrison authorized a complete revision of the search plan based on Elena's structural analysis. Elena worked with the rescue teams throughout the morning, guiding them to 4 additional high-probability survival areas. Not all of these areas contained survivors, but the search process was much more efficient when guided by structural analysis rather than systematic grid searching. By noon on the second day, the rescue operation had found a total of 12 survivors, compared to 0 found during the first 18 hours using conventional methods. Elena's approach had increased the rescue rate dramatically while actually reducing the risk to rescue teams, because they were no longer working in areas where survivors were unlikely to be found anyway. But Elena's growing influence at the disaster scene also created new tensions. Some of the rescue team members resented being guided by someone who wasn't part of their established hierarchy. And some officials from the City Emergency Management Office were uncomfortable with the fact that Elena's expertise had exposed significant problems with their standard operating procedures. The most serious conflict arose when Elena identified what she believed was the most promising survival area in the entire collapse, a section near the center of the building where multiple floor slabs had fallen in a way that created a large void space. Elena's analysis showed that this area could potentially contain a dozen or more survivors, but accessing it would require moving some of the debris that the rescue teams had labeled as too dangerous to disturb. Dr. Rodriguez, I understand your reasoning, Chief Morrison said during a strategy meeting. But the area you're describing would require us to destabilize debris that's currently protecting other potential survival spaces. If we're wrong about the structural situation, we could cause secondary collapses that would kill anyone trapped in the surrounding areas. Elena studied the building diagrams spread across the command post table. Chief Morrison wasn't wrong about the potential risks, but Elena was confident that her analysis accounted for these factors. Chief, I've calculated the load distribution throughout this section of the building. If we remove debris in the sequence I've outlined, we can access the void space without destabilizing the surrounding areas. But you're right that it's more complex than the other rescues we've done. The discussion continued for over an hour, with various rescue team leaders weighing the potential benefits against the possible risks. Elena found herself in the position of advocating for a rescue approach that pushed the boundaries of what the teams were comfortable with. The debate was resolved when Elena's acoustic equipment detected what sounded like multiple people calling for help from the central void space. The sounds were faint and intermittent, suggesting that the trapped people were weakening after more than 24 hours without water or medical attention. We have confirmed survivors in that area, Captain Rodriguez announced after reviewing the acoustic data. Dr. Rodriguez, we need your most detailed structural assessment. If we're going to attempt this rescue, we need to be absolutely certain about the safety protocols. Elena spent the next 3 hours creating a comprehensive plan for accessing the central void space. Her analysis included detailed calculations of load-bearing capacity, precise sequences for debris removal, and contingency plans for various potential complications. Elena's plan called for a carefully coordinated operation involving multiple rescue teams, heavy equipment operators, and structural monitoring specialists. Each step of the debris removal process would be monitored to ensure that the surrounding structure remained stable. The operation began at 4 p.m. on the second day, with Elena serving as the structural advisor for the entire process. She stationed herself at a monitoring position where she could observe the debris pile and immediately detect any signs of structural instability. The first phase of the operation involved removing smaller pieces of debris that were blocking access to the main void space. Elena had identified these pieces as structurally unimportant, and their removal proceeded without complications. The second phase was more challenging. Elena's plan called for using a crane to lift a large concrete slab that was partially blocking the void space. The slab was heavy enough that moving it incorrectly could destabilize the entire area. Elena worked closely with the crane operator, guiding the lifting process to ensure that the slab's weight was transferred gradually to avoid sudden load shifts. The operation took over an hour, but the slab was successfully repositioned without causing any secondary collapses. With the access route clear, the rescue teams were able to enter the central void space for the first time. What they found exceeded even Elena's optimistic expectations. 8 people were trapped in the space, all of them office workers from various floors of the building. They had been protected by the falling debris, which had created a shelter large enough for them to survive with relatively minor injuries. The extraction of 8 survivors from a single location was the most successful rescue operation of the entire disaster response. It brought the total number of rescued survivors to 20 people, a remarkable outcome for a building collapse that had initially been predicted to have no survivors. Elena watched the last of the 8 survivors being loaded into ambulances, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. But she also knew that the success of the central void space rescue raised important questions about standard emergency response procedures. Elena's approach had been successful precisely because it challenged conventional thinking about disaster response. By focusing on the structural mechanics of the building collapse rather than following established search protocols, the rescue operation had been able to find survivors who would otherwise have been missed. But Elena's methods had also required rescue teams to take calculated risks and work in areas they would normally avoid. The approach had worked in this case, but it might not be appropriate for all types of disasters or all rescue teams. Elena realized that her experience at the Meridian building collapse would likely influence emergency response procedures far beyond this single incident. The dramatic difference in rescue success rates between conventional methods and her structural analysis approach would be studied and debated by emergency management professionals for years to come. As the second day of rescue operations concluded, Elena found herself in an unexpected position. She had gone from being an ignored bystander to becoming one of the most influential people at the disaster scene. Her expertise had directly saved 20 lives, and her methods had challenged fundamental assumptions about how rescue operations should be conducted. But Elena also knew that her role as an outside expert had created tensions within the established emergency response system. Some officials were grateful for her contributions, while others were uncomfortable with the precedent of incorporating civilian specialists into active rescue operations. Elena's success had opened a larger conversation about how emergency response systems could better utilize specialized knowledge from outside their traditional structures. It was a conversation that would have implications far beyond this single disaster, affecting how future emergency operations would be planned and executed. 3 months after the Meridian building collapse, Elena Rodriguez stood before a packed auditorium at the National Emergency Management Conference. The audience included emergency responders, government officials, and disaster management specialists from across the country, all gathered to hear about the lessons learned from what had become known as the Structural Analysis Rescue Case Study. The final statistics from the Meridian collapse were sobering: 20 survivors rescued alive, 42 fatalities confirmed, and 38 people still unaccounted for and presumed dead. But everyone in the emergency management community knew that without Elena's intervention, the survivor count would have been much lower. The traditional grid search approach yielded 0 survivors in the first 18 hours of operation, Elena told the audience. The structural analysis approach, implemented over the following 30 hours, located 20 survivors. This represents a fundamental difference in rescue effectiveness that we cannot ignore. Elena had spent the past 3 months analyzing the data from the Meridian rescue, working with emergency management researchers to understand exactly why her approach had been so much more successful than conventional methods. The key factor, Elena explained, was that the Meridian building had failed in a complex pattern that created isolated survival spaces in areas that appeared structurally dangerous. Conventional search methods, which prioritized rescuer safety by focusing on the most stable areas, had systematically avoided the areas where survivors were most likely to be found.
This creates a fundamental tension in disaster response, Elena continued. Safety protocols that protect rescue workers can also reduce the effectiveness of survivor location efforts. We need to find ways to manage this tension without abandoning either safety or effectiveness.
Elena's presentation included detailed case studies of each successful rescue from the Meridian collapse, showing how structural analysis had identified survivor locations that would have been missed by conventional search methods. The most dramatic example was the Central Void Space rescue, where 8 people had been found in an area that conventional protocols would have deemed too dangerous to access. Elena's structural analysis had shown that the area could be safely accessed with proper planning, but it had required rescue teams to work outside their normal comfort zones. The lesson here is not that safety protocols are wrong, Elena emphasized. The lesson is that we need better methods for assessing when apparent risks are actually manageable with proper expertise. Elena's research had identified similar collapse patterns in other earthquake disasters around the world, showing that the Meridian situation was not unique. Buildings that failed in complex torsional patterns often created survival spaces in areas that appeared too dangerous for rescue teams to access. Elena had been working with engineering schools and emergency management programs to develop new training curricula that would help rescue teams better understand structural collapse patterns. The goal was to give rescue workers the knowledge they needed to safely access high-probability survival areas that might otherwise be avoided. But Elena's work had also revealed deeper problems with how emergency response systems incorporated specialized expertise from outside their established structures. The most important lesson from the Meridian collapse is not technical, Elena told the conference audience. It's organizational. The rescue operation initially failed not because of inadequate equipment or poorly trained personnel, but because the system was not designed to effectively utilize available expertise. Elena had interviewed dozens of emergency responders who had worked at the Meridian collapse, trying to understand why her initial offers of assistance had been rejected. The answers revealed a complex set of factors that went beyond simple bureaucratic obstacles. Many rescue workers explained that they received offers of help from unqualified civilians at every disaster scene. Self-appointed experts who had watched disaster movies or read internet articles would frequently approach rescue teams with advice and suggestions, most of which were dangerous or counterproductive. Elena's initial approach to the rescue teams had unfortunately fit the pattern of these unwanted civilian interventions. Despite her qualifications, she had been categorized as another well-meaning bystander because the rescue teams had no established procedure for evaluating and incorporating legitimate outside expertise. We need to develop better mechanisms for identifying and utilizing qualified specialists who are not part of the formal emergency response structure, Elena said. This is particularly important for technical specialties like structural engineering, where the relevant expertise may not be available within traditional rescue teams. Elena's recommendations included the development of pre-credentialed specialist pools that could be rapidly activated during disasters, better communication protocols for evaluating outside offers of assistance, and training programs to help incident commanders distinguish between qualified experts and unqualified volunteers. Elena had been working with FEMA and other federal agencies to implement pilot programs based on these recommendations. The programs were being tested in disaster response exercises, with encouraging preliminary results. But Elena knew that changing established emergency response procedures was a slow process that would require sustained effort over many years. After Elena's presentation, she was approached by Maria Santos, the woman whose vigil at the police barriers had helped motivate Elena's unauthorized rescue attempt. "Dr. Rodriguez," Maria said, "I wanted to thank you again for what you did. Michael Chen told me that if you hadn't found them when you did, Robert Martinez probably wouldn't have survived another day." Elena was gratified to hear that all 3 of the people she had found in the Northeast Void Space had recovered from their injuries. Robert Martinez, who had been unconscious when Elena found him, had suffered a serious head injury that required months of rehabilitation, but he was expected to make a full recovery. Maria's husband Carlos had been found 2 days later in a different part of the building, alive but with severe crush injuries to his legs. Elena's structural analysis had helped guide the rescue teams to Carlos's location as well, though his extraction had required a complex operation involving orthopedic surgeons working inside the debris pile. "Dr. Rodriguez, there's something else I wanted to tell you," Maria said. "My husband Carlos has been following your work since the collapse. He's been talking to other survivors, and they want to do something to honor what you did." Maria explained that the Meridian survivors had formed a support group to help each other cope with the trauma of the collapse. The group had decided to establish a scholarship fund for students studying emergency management and structural engineering, inspired by Elena's work at the disaster scene. Elena was moved by the survivors' gesture, but she was also aware that her role at the Meridian collapse had become somewhat mythologized in the media coverage of the disaster. News reports had focused on the dramatic story of the ignored expert who had saved 20 lives, but they had sometimes oversimplified the complex organizational and technical factors that had contributed to both the initial problems and the eventual success. Elena was careful to emphasize that the rescue operation had ultimately succeeded because of the professionalism and dedication of the official rescue teams, not because of any individual heroics on her part. The rescue workers at the Meridian collapse were skilled and committed professionals, Elena told Maria. The problem wasn't with their capabilities, it was with the system's ability to effectively coordinate all available resources. Once they understood the value of structural analysis, they incorporated it brilliantly into their operations. Elena's ongoing work focused on systemic improvements rather than individual responses to disasters. She was working with emergency management agencies to develop better procedures for identifying and utilizing outside expertise, and she was training rescue teams to better understand structural collapse patterns. Elena had also become involved in building safety advocacy, working to strengthen seismic building codes and retrofit requirements. The Meridian building collapse had demonstrated that even moderate earthquakes could be catastrophic when they struck older buildings that hadn't been designed to modern standards. Elena's seismic safety report from 3 years before the collapse had accurately predicted the building's vulnerability, but the city had chosen not to implement her recommendations due to cost concerns. Elena was now working with other cities to develop more effective policies for addressing seismically dangerous buildings before disasters occurred. 6 months after the collapse, Elena received a call from David Chen, the FEMA coordinator who had tried to help her get official authorization for her rescue efforts. "Elena, I have some news that I think you'll find interesting," David said. "FEMA is implementing a new rapid specialist deployment protocol based on lessons learned from the Meridian collapse. We're creating a system for pre-credentialing structural engineers and other technical specialists so they can be officially attached to disaster response operations within hours instead of days." Elena was pleased to hear about the policy change, but she also knew that institutional reforms moved slowly through government bureaucracies. "How long do you think it will take to get the new protocols fully operational?" Elena asked. David paused. "Well, we're hoping to have the pilot program ready for testing within 2 years. Full implementation probably won't happen for another 3 to 5 years after that." Elena considered the timeline David had described. If a disaster similar to the Meridian collapse occurred during the next few years, the same organizational problems that had delayed her participation would likely recur. Elena realized that creating lasting change in emergency response systems would require sustained advocacy and education efforts that went far beyond her individual experience at the Meridian collapse. Elena had begun speaking at emergency management conferences around the country, sharing the lessons learned from the Meridian collapse and advocating for better integration of technical specialists into disaster response operations. Elena had also started consulting with emergency management agencies to review their specialist utilization procedures and recommend improvements. But Elena knew that the most important changes would happen at the local level, with individual rescue teams and incident commanders who understood the value of incorporating outside expertise into their operations. Elena's work at the Meridian collapse had demonstrated that significant improvements in rescue effectiveness were possible when technical specialists were properly integrated into emergency response operations. But it had also shown that achieving these improvements required overcoming significant organizational and cultural barriers within the emergency management community. Elena's ongoing efforts focused on breaking down these barriers through education, training, and policy advocacy. She was working to create a future where qualified specialists like herself would be immediately recognized and utilized during disaster responses, rather than being dismissed as interfering civilians. 1 year after the Meridian collapse, Elena stood once again at the site where the building had fallen. The debris had been cleared away, and the lot was being prepared for new construction. The new building would be designed to modern seismic standards, incorporating lessons learned from the failure of its predecessor. Elena reflected on how the disaster had changed her own career and perspective. Before the collapse, she had been primarily an academic researcher focused on understanding seismic risks and building vulnerabilities. Now she was actively involved in emergency response training and policy development, working to ensure that her technical knowledge could be effectively applied during actual disasters. Elena's experience had taught her that technical expertise was only valuable if it could be effectively communicated and implemented by the people who needed to use it. The most sophisticated structural analysis was worthless if rescue teams couldn't access and apply that knowledge during emergency operations. Elena's work now focused on bridging the gap between technical knowledge and operational implementation, helping emergency response systems better utilize the full range of expertise available to them. Elena knew that there would be future disasters, and some of those disasters would create survivor location challenges similar to what had occurred at the Meridian collapse. Elena's goal was to ensure that when those disasters occurred, the emergency response system would be better prepared to identify, evaluate, and utilize the specialized knowledge needed to save as many lives as possible. The lessons learned from the Meridian collapse would hopefully prevent future situations where qualified experts were pushed aside while people died waiting for rescue. But Elena knew that achieving that goal would require ongoing vigilance and advocacy to maintain the organizational changes that her experience had helped to initiate. As Elena walked away from the construction site, she felt a sense of both accomplishment and responsibility. Her work at the Meridian collapse had saved 20 lives, but it had also revealed systemic problems that could affect the outcomes of future disasters. Elena's commitment to addressing these problems would continue long after the media attention from the Meridian collapse had faded, driven by the knowledge that her ongoing efforts might help ensure that no future expert would ever again be shoved aside while lives hung in the balance.